Welcome everyone to the Edith Wheeler Memorial Library. This is the final installment of Art Gottlieb's lecture on the 20th century by decade part 2. I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor for this program, the Friends of the Library. Now, without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Art Gottlieb.
Hi, everyone. Well, time goes by fast. It's our last session already. This is the last one in a large two-part series covering the entire 20th century. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. You know, the 1990s, as I had mentioned for the last one, I mean, this is a period of time now, unlike so many of the other historical topics I talk about that occurred, before I was born or before I had, cognizance of the world. This one, I was like a bona fide adult. And so I'm going through all of these events of the 1990s, and I can't help but have a certain flavor of how I experienced it and where I experienced it and what it meant to me. So forgive me for that bias, but I think it's useful as well. And the 1990s started for me still in graduate school at Hunter. And it's, of course, in Manhattan, part of the CUNY system, and all of that's been in the news. Personal side note, I was accepted to Columbia University, but I couldn't afford it. So I took the other route and I went to Hunter, which was literally 1/5 of the price. And I'm feeling pretty good that I didn't go to Hunter, that I didn't go to Columbia this week. Just a personal little bias of mine, I think, from current events. But it was an incredible period of time. As a military historian, I see, and a political historian from that standpoint, I see the 1990s being bookended by two major events. Well, we talked about last time that had already been in process, the fall of the Soviet Union. And we talked about Reagan and Gorbachev, et cetera, in our last installment. But by 1990, 1991, it was already in full swing and saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it ended literally something that had been for people my age and older, something that had existed forever, the Cold War, right? For somebody my age who didn't live before, I wasn't alive around World War II, right? So the Cold War was always there, this threat of nuclear Armageddon, we're going to get bombed by the Russians, we're going to bomb the Russians. And it didn't end until the fall of the Soviet Union. And that is, for me, the beginning of the 1990s. And we had this thing called like the peace dividend. And the peace dividend meant, well, shoot, what do we need this massive infrastructure for, right? There was an overlap of time in 1990 where I was already working at the Intrepid Sea-Air-Space Museum, and we had the arrival of this gigantic Air Force aircraft, which was a spy airplane, which was, most people know it as the SR-71 Blackbird. But in fact, the one we had was an A-12 Blackbird, right, which is the predecessor, but it was the same exact thing. And what that meant was that it was such an expensive program that the United States did not have to spend money anymore spying on the Soviets, flying at Mach 3+3+ over the Soviet Union, taking pictures because, well, there was no more Soviet Union. And supposedly the threat of this nuclear Armageddon was over. So now anything we can do, we can just do with cheaper satellites. So the handful of these aircraft were distributed to various museums, and we got our hands on one. And that just represents that Cold War dividend right there. And additionally, another point I wanted to make before I get started and when I was in school, one of the things that surprised me, I had a pretty rigorous bachelor's education, and for psychology. very biologically based and all the rest of that stuff, very research oriented. And when I was in school in at Hunter for a master's degree, there was this massive ideology that was being promoted right then between 1989 and 1991 when I was there, the beginning of our segment that we're talking about today, the 1990s. And it was pushing for this thing called multiculturalism. And I tell this story because I think that would also be very useful as far as putting some current events in perspective. And it surprised me, and I became kind of like a persona non gratis in my own school, in a sense, because the idea was that anybody who had any kind of traditional American values, um, in the way I understood them at least, was now passe. And what is in fashion and what was being promoted by this institution was people's cultures of origin or heritage, you see. So in other words, it was the opposite of the melting pot. So the melting pot meant, like when my grandparents came here, as my parents told me, and they told me themselves, my grandparents, you came to the United States and it was the best chance anybody would ever have to become as equal as a person could be. And they wanted to blend in. They wanted to be part of the American dream. They wanted to become part of the American culture. They did their best to shed their languages, although they couldn't shed their um, accents. And so now here in 1990, I was faced with the opposite, which was saying that you don't want the American dream. You should not aspire to the American dream. You should not aspire to be American. You should aspire to keep the identity of your place of origin or your family's place of origin. And essentially, that was superior to what was already then in 1990 perceived by this ideology to be a failed American experiment. And that America was really responsible for genocide around the world and pretty much everything that I always thought. So opposite of everything I always thought and was raised to believe. And that was an uncomfortable place for me, especially with the overlap of my having joined the staff of the Intrepid by then. And sometimes I would wear things like, my Intrepid shirt or that, and I was widely mocked and ridiculed because everybody knows that the only purpose of the United States military is for the oppression of lesser peoples around the world. But anyway, that's another story. But it's very interesting. It's very, very interesting stuff for me. The Gulf War in the early part of the 1990s was something that really overlapped my initial experiences. Certainly now that I was overlapped, in the military environment, the military history environment. And the Intrepid played host to many events for the Gulf War veterans who were returning home. And I want to talk about the Gulf War for a second because it's very important to understand historically. In 1990, the United States was still in the long shadow of Vietnam. For those of you who remember that long shadow that I'm talking about. And the long shadow of Vietnam was that the war was a shameful enterprise because we didn't have clear goals and our soldiers came back having felt as though they weren't respected for serving their country, and were widely mocked and ridiculed as being baby killers and this sort of a thing. So it also brings us back, interestingly, to some of the events of the last few days as far as campus protests. All right. But soldiers that I was dealing with as veterans from Vietnam, who were still relatively young, they were, in a sense, traumatized, if not directly by combat, but socially, because for the first time, the Vietnam War had left people with the feeling as though they were outcasts, right? All of the other wars, people were proud of your service. It wasn't questioned. Even if things ended in I wouldn't call it a stalemate, more of an armistice like the Korean War, it was never questioned that you were serving your country honorably. And Vietnam was the first time that that happened. And it left a large mark and a deep shadow about everything that the United States shouldn't do. And as I mentioned in earlier lectures, it also brought up the notion that the federal government was lying to us, right? Because we were told that, we had these metrics and we were winning and everything, and we weren't. And there was a lot of today what we would call misinformation, which is just a euphemism for being lied to, of course. And Vietnam left a very long shadow. So the first Persian Gulf War, um, what that was about was as a leftover effect of the Iran-Iraq War, right? Which was boiling for quite some time before this period. It left Iraq in a state of practical bankruptcy. I mean, it was highly expensive for Iraq. And this little tiny neighboring country, which I know I never heard of before, not that that's any measure, wait, was being blamed by Saddam Hussein, who was in charge of Iraq, of course. So Saddam Hussein is blaming the Kuwaitis of inflating the price of oil, right? And they're essentially flooding the market. They're flooding the market with oil, which so has the opposite effect, not inflating the price of oil, but liquidating it. And Saddam Hussein felt that was enough of a reason for him to go in and invade this little country called Kuwait, right? So this was now, it turned over to the United Nations. And so the first time that we had a United Nations Security Council action like this was, in fact, going into Korea. And when you're doing something with the United Nations, it was very important because now you have something called a coalition force. And this is very important for the United States to have done because we didn't want to have made the mistake that we had in Vietnam where we were acting and we weren't on any kind of set of controls or goals. It was the opposite of the Vietnam War. We were going to have a set mandate to go in and drive the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And once that mission was completed, then it was going to be completed and we were going to go home. You see, it was literally those parameters were going to be the opposite of Vietnam, where we didn't have a clear goal and we didn't have an exit plan. And we just kept kind of like incrementally adding forces because we didn't know how to get out of it. So the Security Council, led by the United States, of course, goes into Kuwait, and we have this little war. You remember Norman Schwarzkopf, etc. And it was a big deal, right? For somebody who's interested in military history, it was a big deal. And then down at the Intrepid, I was, helping with the arrangements. I marched in the Persian Gulf War. So the Persian Gulf War parade in Manhattan was to be an antidote for the lack of um, um, kudos to soldiers coming back from Vietnam, right? We were going to make sure that the Americans who served in the first Persian Gulf War were going to come back and they weren't going to suffer the indignity of being spat upon and ridiculed and mocked, you see. And we weren't going to sweep it under the rug. We were going to celebrate them. I was in the parade with them. I was in charge of aircraft restoration at that particular time. We had an airplane of the type that was two aircraft that were of the type that flew in the Persian Gulf War, and I was in charge of the airplane, and we had an airplane that was like a rolling exhibit in the parade. So that was a pretty big deal back in those days. We have many things here. I've got about 8 pages of notes. All right. So I'm just going to go through some of this stuff over here. Now, also, Um, the other bookend of the 1990s, now that I gave you the beginning of the bookend, which was the end of the Soviet Union, on the other end of the bookend, right, the other bookend would be the beginning of the War on Terror. You see, so, and of course that happened, you would say officially in once George W. Bush became president, and immediately into his presidency, we had the attack on 9/11/2001, right? So of course that skips forward slightly into 2001, but that's where I'm going to put the bookend. And so we had the peace dividend decade ending with the war on starting with the war, ending with the war on terror, the beginning of the war on terror, which you might say we're still in. How many people remember the first attack on the Twin Towers? The ones that happened during the Clinton administration. And that was a truck driving into the sub-basement of I think it was the South Tower of the Twin Towers, and then detonated this massive bomb. And I suppose the idea was that you were going to destroy the foundation of the Twin Towers, or one of them, and the thing was going to come toppling down. The thing was pretty robustly built, though, as it turns out. But that was something that kind of came and went as some like this weird anomaly, right? Nobody was really focused on it. And we didn't take that as any kind of a wake-up call to say, hey, there's this large terrorist entity out there that is looking to do severe damage to the United States. We just saw it as, we treated it as a, let the cops handle it, in a way that like some people got out of the bed the wrong way one morning and they decided to do this random thing. And that was it. And then, of course, when this was repeated successfully in 2001, everybody looked back to that other event and say, why didn't we take this more seriously? Which is just essentially basically the way people and governments are. If you just don't want to see something, you just don't see it, you know? And we were in the middle of our peace dividend, and I'm not sure we really wanted to be bothered with the notion that there was going to be this other massive threat that was going to be the equivalent of another Cold War. I just don't think that we were ready to face that. It was, inconceivable from the standpoint of our denial that we thought we were just done. I mean, the end of the Cold War was a significant event. We had fought in the First World War, the Second World War. We had defeated Nazism. We had defeated Imperial Japanese, Mussolini, etc. And then we had this thing with the Soviet Union, who we perceived through Soviet communism to want to take over the world based on the Marxist doctrine that all forms of government worldwide need to be replaced by a one world socialist government. You see, once that was over, we were like, well, who's there left to fight? And I think it's also part of our own prejudice, from my own standpoint. I think that, we looked at what we perceive to be secondary cultures, like the Islamist culture, and say, well, we looked at them like we looked at the Japanese before World War II and say, well, here's a bunch of people running around in caves and they're backward people. And what do they know? And it's an oppressive, closed society. And we were building in the 1990s, we were building a global economy, and everybody surely was just going to get on board with it. And it was just unstoppable. And we were a little bit drunk with it, and still are. Other smaller agreements, which if you live there, it's not so small. There was this thing called the Good Friday Agreement between the United Kingdom and the IRA in Northern Ireland. And so it marked the end of 25 years of hostility. I wonder if you remember those terrorist attacks that were always occurring in Great Britain on the part of the Irish, who were, obviously angry at the British for so long. And depending on who you speak to, still are, right? Fascinating subject that doesn't get talked about very, very much. I did several programs last month on Irish Americans, right? And I found a lot of material about Irish people who had emigrated to the United States since before the Revolutionary War. And the history of animosity towards Great Britain by Irish is very long and is very significant in our history. I'm not saying it's ill-founded at all. It's just an interesting part of American history that I don't ever remember hearing about. I was able to find up some material. It's a good presentation in that regard. One of the things that Bill Clinton put into place was the North American Free Trade Agreement, which we heard a lot about during the Trump administration, because obviously former President Trump thought NAFTA was one of the things that really caused a problem in the decimation of United States industry. And NAFTA, the idea was, in the standpoint of globalization, was to, at least in North America, eliminate whatever trade tariffs or barriers there were between Mexico, the United States, and Canada specifically. And it changed things to the point where it literally became cheaper to build things in other places. And whether or not your point of view lends you to think that was a bad thing for the United States or a good thing, that is something else. That's tied to one's ideology of whether it's the purpose of government to do the right thing for your country first, or to do the right thing for the world first, with your country just being a sub part of that, right? That's ideology and that's politics. So, speaking of Bill Clinton, I mean, he was a seminal figure, of course, in the 1990s, as was his wife, Hillary Clinton. Another thing that marked the 1990s was the ascension to power of many women figures. And I think that Hillary Clinton fit the role of that as well. She, more so than anybody else before her, was a kind of like a partner in the presidency, in my opinion, and attained a lot of stature in that regard. And Bill Clinton is an interesting person. I met him. I met him at the Intrepid, and had my picture taken with him. He's like, is kind of like Bill Clinton was. It seemed like somebody you just wanted to sit down and have a beer with. He seemed like an approachable fellow. And I liked him. I told him I thought he was doing a good job. And he told me in his southern, he says, well, thank you for that. This was in the middle of like the Monica Lewinsky scandal. So I don't know. He seemed to be happy with what I said to him, that I thought he was doing a good job. So we'll just leave it at that. Speaking of the Lewinsky scandal, that was a spectacle, wasn't it? We had a number of these very salacious, dripping with sexuality kind of stories. And, by this time, you've got cable TV and you've got different news outlets. The 24/7 news cycle was another phenomenon that began in the 1990s with the Persian Gulf War. And I wonder if you remember Ted Turner's CNN back in those days was, this serious, no nonsense, just the facts kind of like reporting. And it was 24/7. I mean, you could turn on the CNN any day, any time of day. And, it was, for me, who was like always a news junkie anyway, had a sort of an addictive effect to it. And for me, from my mind, back in those days, CNN became the thing of record at that time. CNN was playing on the background when things were going on. And it was kind of a phenomenon that started this market for 24-hour a day, 7-day a week, literal broadcasting. And that's obviously the world we live in today. But Bill Clinton and the Monica Lewinsky scandal. So what I mean, this deserves its own presentation with all of the characters that were involved with that and everything else like that. But I don't have to remind you of the details of that. Monica Lewinsky, of course, is still around. And whatever she is going to do in her life, I suppose, is going to be most famous for this particular episode. And I remember even during the time, it's a long time ago, but I remember people's feelings about it. And some people were like, it was horrible that the Oval Office was disrespected in this regard. And people had this feeling like, well, that's my Oval Office. And he, the president, doesn't have the right to do what he did. And it hurt the stature of America. And other people were like, who cares? It's just sex, And if it makes him a better president, what the hell? So I remember those literal 2 points of view, and maybe most of us fell in between. I'm not in a position to say so. But he got impeached, if you recall. And then it gave us, really the first in my lifetime, the first special prosecutor, right? And now it seems like we have a lot of special prosecutors. And Kenneth Starr. And of course, Clinton was acquitted by those charges. The House of Representatives brings the impeachment, and the Senate acts as, like a judge and a jury listening to evidence. And he was acquitted of the charges. And the charge was lying under oath. And so that was towards the end of the decade. He was acquitted on February 12th, 1999. So Bill Clinton, I also remember, was trying to mediate peace in a number of ways between the Palestinians, if you remember that. And also, we had a lot of unrest in areas that were part of the former Soviet Union, right? Places in the Balkans, the former Yugoslavia. And so, for instance, we have, and this has to do with current events as well, the Oslo Accords, if you remember that. Negotiated by Bill Clinton, September 1993. And it was between the Palestinian Prime Minister, Yasser Arafat, right? Now I know what a kafia is, right? Beforehand, I remember Yasser Arafat always had that thing with that sort of checkered pattern. Now, of course, I've seen literally thousands of them over the last few days. But Prime Minister Yasser Arafat and Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, they agreed to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process as a result of the Oslo Accords. And the Palestinians agreed to recognize Israel's right to exist. And Israel was going to permit the creation of an autonomous Palestinian national authority, right, consisting of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And that was implemented in 1994, right? And Israel was to withdraw from those territories, and that marked the end of what was referred to as the first Intifada. Another thing we've seen over the last few days, hanging from banners, etc., including Hamilton Hall in Columbia. And the first Intifada was from 1987 to 1993. Now, as a result of this agreement, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by somebody who obviously felt that he had sold out. And that was the end of Yitzhak Rabin. You also had the creation at this period of time of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan in its, semi-recent form, right? Which was something that directly led up to what we called our war on terrorism. So at the end of the Afghan Civil War, the Taliban had seized control of Afghanistan. That was in 1996, right? 1996. And that was after the Soviets were there for a long time, et cetera, et cetera. And why this is important, it was because it was the Taliban being in control of Afghanistan. And the reasoning is when we actually invaded Afghanistan after 9/11, the idea was that we wanted to get the bad guys who had arranged this attack on New York and Washington and the aircraft that crash landed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the 9/11 attacks. And it was this thing called Al Qaeda, right, with Osama bin Laden. And to be able to get Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, purportedly not for revenge, which, that's, of course, it was revenge. But and additionally, we wanted to keep them from doing it again. And back in those days, you needed to have a central location. You just couldn't do everything remotely, like many of us do something like we're doing today on our Zoom call. You had to have a headquarters, and that headquarters was in Afghanistan. And the only reason why Al Qaeda was able to have a training ground in Afghanistan and a headquarters is because the Taliban gave them permission to do so. So we literally had to go to war with the Taliban to get to Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. And I remember, if those of you who remember, even when um, President Obama had said that Afghanistan was more or less a just cause to go in, but it was Iraq that was wrong, you see. So this is a period of time, of course, we're going to revisit, for most of us who, lived through this experience from watching it on television or whatever overlap we have with it directly or indirectly. I think that we were just glad to have that behind us. But in a certain amount of time, we're going to need to go back and look at these things, and we will. Another big deal of the 1990s, certainly from my standpoint, I mean, I may have told you this, when I was at the Intrepid now, when I was essentially in charge of exhibits, by that time, I was there from 1989 to 1997. So this flatbed arrives and, somebody finds me on the ship or in the museum, wherever I was. And I have to go down and sign for what just arrived at the front of the museum on this flatbed. And it was two pieces of the Berlin Wall, right, which were being separated into sections and distributed out, and the other ones being destroyed, of course. And it was the most interesting thing, these two pieces of the Berlin Wall. I mean, this ugly utilitarian kind of two slabs, right? Probably around, I forgot how high they were at this point. And on one side of this ugly concrete barrier, there was covered in graffiti. And on the other side, it was just completely bare concrete. And that itself tells the story of the Berlin Wall, because on one side, you had the ability to walk right up to it and spray paint whatever you wanted on it. And on the other side, you couldn't even get close to the wall. You would have been shot. And it's just literally a fascinating piece of communist history East-West Cold War history. A really very stirring, very moving. And the German reunification, right, that followed the fall of the Berlin Wall was a pretty big deal to me. I was one of these students in a period of time where all through school, it was Germany looked like this. It had a big line through it, and you had West Germany and East Germany. That was it, you know. So for somebody who remembers all of that, the reunification of Germany and what that represented to people was a very, very significant event, a very significant event. And that gave, you know, thought to that promise at the beginning of the 1990s that, you know, everything that we've lived through in the mid to late 20th century has come to fruition from the standpoint where we're victorious with the Cold War. Finally, we're victorious with what was the legacy of World War II. And who's there left to fight? You see, some of the people who were casting blame around as far as our, I don't know, blind spot, if you will, call it what you want, about how 9/11 2001 was able to occur under our noses was because of this peace dividend that we had and our unwillingness to think that there was something else out there that was going to be a significant threat after all of those years of being pent up with, you know, the thought of nuclear Armageddon, you see. So we just sort of chose not to think about it, focus on it anymore, right? Who was there left to fight? European Union was formed in 1992. And I'm not a European, um, you know, but from the reading I've done, et cetera, I mean, that was a good thing and it was a bad thing in a sense. From a good thing, it created a collaboration of countries, if you will, that was able to create an economic, monetary force, the first one in history that could really rival the United States as far as trade, as far as technology was concerned, the pooling of resources. You know, so it's the Europe under the European Union was like the United States of Europe almost, you know, and from a bad standpoint, the quaintness that European countries seem to have as far as, you know, if you went to Luxembourg, they had one kind of money. If you went to Germany, they had a different kind of money. If you went to Italy, they had a different kind of money. France, etc. Right. And then all of that was replaced by this euro. Right. So, you know, and then things are controlled in the same way that people lament that we've lost our parts of our regional character from the overall control of Washington, D.C., which wants to make everything one size fits all from, you know, Maine to San Diego. You know, the Europeans lamented that they lost their individual sense of character because they were forced to do things from a central government. And where is that? Brussels, I guess. But of course, then you had, I mean, I remember when I was young, it was a big deal that there was another aircraft company that was rivaling Boeing, right? Airbus, right? And it seemed, wow, look at that. There's a European company that's making airplanes that are comparable to the incomparable back in those days, Boeing, right? Right now, Boeing's got a black eye, of course, you know, but certainly when I was growing up, it was, you know, if it ain't Boeing, I ain't going. So, um, those are other things that occurred in the 1990s, very significant. And here's something that never gets talked about. This is actually it's a political military thing, but it's really an environmental thing from my standpoint. I did a program on this, but nobody really seemed to care about it. You know, I mean, there are things that people care about. There are things that people seem to find interesting, but it's too disturbing for them, so they They seem irritated that I'm putting them through this, right? So I don't show this program anymore. I have a program called the Kuwaiti oil fires, right? So if you're an environmentalist, you would find this interesting, and but for most people, it's disturbing. Um, do you remember during the Persian Gulf War that I was talking about before? Well, what Saddam Hussein had ordered his forces to do was, because now they had to retreat from Kuwait, that they set ablaze dozens of these oil heads of these Kuwaiti oil wells, right? And they smashed them, of course, so they couldn't be put out, right? So you can't just, go up there in some garb or suit or something and turn a valve and have the thing shut off. What they deliberately did was they used explosives to literally blow the valve off of the thing. So you just had this raw pipe with pressurized oil coming through it that was now on fire, right? So it created these blowtorches, dozens and dozens and dozens of blowtorches, right? With millions of gallons of raw fuel being literally burned in the atmosphere. And this, combined with another little gift that Saddam Hussein gave us, was to take on the water, you had these places where you would fill up the tankers, right, in the Persian Gulf, and they literally opened up the valves and created what was now, between the fires and the oil spill that resulted in that, was the single largest man-made environmental disaster, right? Outside of like Chernobyl, right? Which is kind of in a different class by itself. At least Chernobyl was an accident. This was deliberate. And hundreds of millions of gallons were now in the water and in the air in the form of live soot, and the sky was completely black. Um, and do you even remember this? This is a long time ago. And I remember watching this. I had just, I guess I had just gotten married, I suppose. I don't remember. And it was like 1991. And so my wife had this damn TV. You know what I remember? She had this shitty TV, right? And the thing would, you'd be in the middle of watching something and the thing would go black. And you had to smack the son of a bitch on both sides, right? Boom. And then it would come back on. And I remember my hands hurting because I had to smack the TV. Isn't that stupid that I remember that? And but anyway, the Kuwaiti oil fires. It's a good scene in there's some movies that have it in it, right? Um, it's just was an amazing, incredible, tragic event, if you recall that, from an environmental standpoint and a dramatic standpoint, you see. And of course, the United States and coalition forces had to figure out how to go in there, and you had to have these long cranes and actually smother the fire coming out from the pipe. And then once that was done, and it was just raw oil coming out now, then you could cap it. But what an operation. And something I never hear get talked about. I remember the 1990s as being a period of kind of the haves and the have-nots as far as computer knowledge, right? So there were people who were going to be like, I'm never going to touch one of those things, a computer that is. And, you people are all crazy, and why do I need that? And there were people who were like completely in, and you have to have it. And the whole world is going to run on this, and you better get on board. Right. So put yourself back in the period of time in the early mid 1990s, I had a lot of naysayers around me. And at the Intrepid, I mean, I was directly working with people who were, deciding whether or not a place like the Intrepid Museum even needed a website, and how you were going to get a website, and if anybody was going to look at a website, and And then it was like this half denial, half aspiration. And it's like, what should we do? Right. And I experienced that in two other places I worked at too. And, it seemed like in most of the places I was at, I had more knowledge about the internet or how to get on the internet. There was still a lot of people around, you're typically older than me, but not much older than me, that were in a complete state of denial that the world was going to turn into this web-based thing, right? Where everything was going to be on the internet, let alone having financial transactions be conducted on the internet. And, obviously that's completely the world we live in today, right? But back then there was a tremendous amount of resistance to it. And people didn't, it was that people resented it because a lot of the people who were involved in computers tended to be, kind of nerdy and snarky and I know something that you don't, and therefore I'm more powerful than you. And you know what? They were more powerful than you. And that just created, especially in the male-oriented environment that I was around, people resented that. We don't need that. When I had a computer on my desk at the Intrepid, I was the first one who had a computer. And I was doing all my documents on computer because I had come straight out of school, and I just did everything on the computer. And I was widely mocked by all these veterans that were coming into my office because I interfaced with all of these veterans on a constant basis, right? And they were highly mocking me. Oh, there goes the organization. Art's got a computer, and that was the kind of derisive comments that were coming. And so the internet is a big deal. It's a really, really big deal. Do you need a website? Are you getting all your information on email? Are you ordering things online? Back in those days, I still had big catalogs of stuff. We had catalogs of everything, the Rolodex, you see. And this is this tremendous transformational period. Put yourself back in those days and remember what it might have been like for you. PC ownership rose from 15% to 35%. Certainly it was before Wi-Fi. So it was still an appliance that had to be that you were locked into, on your desk or something. I mean, today, of course, before this protocol was invented, the only way you could answer your emails, right? Even in the 1990s, you had the BlackBerry. I don't remember if that came out in the 1990s or not, but certainly where I was in Manhattan and spent a lot of time, you had a lot of these business types and people were still dressed up in these suits and everything. And then the whole world learned how to, you know, type with your thumbs. And then we had this beginning of this other social phenomenon where people became completely addicted to their devices, right? Completely addicted to their devices. And I'm not criticizing anybody because like I'm addicted to my device. I mean it's I would sooner walk out of this house without my pants on than without my smartphone. And that's the sad truth. I'm like, did I get an email? I'm waiting for a follow-up on this. Wait a minute, let me look on the internet and see if I can find this. You see, let me double check this. It's just unbelievable, right? It's good and it's bad, obviously. So, and but this was the beginning of it. This was the beginning of it. I was hooking up computers for my colleagues and things like that on the Intrepid and later on. And it's like they were just, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. I want this whole computer thing to go away. I don't want to do this. I'm too old. I don't care. It's a fad. It's going to end. And that was part of the phenomenon in the 1990s that I recall very much. Digital cameras, right? Another thing you see from the standpoint of technology, right? I've got a camera suite down in my basement. I don't even, like, I think I know where it is, But when I was younger, I used to love my SLR, my single lens reflex camera. In this particular case, I was a Minolta guy and I had Minolta suite of lenses, right, which kind of marries you to a camera base because you don't want to shift to another suite of lenses, you know? And it was expensive, you know? Some of those lenses cost $500 back in the day, et cetera. All of these different things that I was able to do. When I was in school, it was an art school, so um, they had a 24-hour darkroom, and it was magnificent. I loved it. And now I don't even think about it anymore, right? Everything I do, my smartphone, my iPhone Pro has a better camera than anything you could possibly imagine. It's just incredible what you can do. And you can do all of the editing. You send pictures immediately. You know, I don't have to tell you, you do it every day, right? But this was a big deal. And companies like that you would never think could possibly be bankrupt were headed straight for bankruptcy. Companies like Kodak, right? Saying that Kodak was going to go bankrupt would be like saying that Apple Computer right now is going to go bankrupt. It's laughable. In the 1940s, if you said that the Pennsylvania Railroad was going to be bankrupt by 1960, it would seem ridiculous. But it was bankrupt by 1960. And so was the New York Central Railroad and the New York, Hartford, and New Haven line. And they all had to like merge into these massive mergers. And Kodak, I remember, I wonder if you even noticed, I know I noticed, was had to it was so painful to watch. Kodak had like every single patent that you could possibly imagine, right? As far as film development and every kind of all of these different sorts of accessories that went with photography. And they had to sell the patents one by one by one by one just to keep the doors open, right? It was like watching Sears go out of business. And because digital, they just didn't imagine that digital photography was going to literally make film photography obsolete for the average consumer, you see. Um, Here's another one. This was, of course, at the end of the 1990s. I wonder if you remember this. Remember this scare that was called Y2K, right? So it was that computers they couldn't calculate beyond 1999, right? At you know, the 11th hour hitting midnight into the next millennium, that like the world was going to stop because all the computers were going to stop and everything was going to grind to a halt that ran by computer, which was quite a few things by that point, you see. And then it was like this whole thing. People were, I mean, I never got into it, you know, but it was people were stocking up on food and doing all this crazy survivalist stuff and making sure they had gasoline for their generators and water. Um, I wonder if you were around somebody, or maybe you were somebody who was concerned that like things were going to grind to a halt because a computer was not going to know what to do when the hour struck midnight on December 31st, 1999. Right? That seems almost silly now, but I remember it being a big deal then, right? 1990s, to continue something I started talking about last week, the 1990s saw the increase in the imports of Japanese cars, particularly, right? And by this time, the 1990s, people had become used to driving foreign cars, you know, which was kind of a thing that there was a lot of resistance to. You know, a lot of people who were around in the 70s, the 80s, and 90s were still, I mean, probably one of the most extreme examples, maybe not extreme example, was somebody like my own father, right? You know, and I told my father in, I think it was, I don't know, 1990, I think it was, when I was already driving a was 1990. Yeah, I had already had owned a Honda Civic 5-speed, and the car was like basically indestructible. It was like an appliance practically. You couldn't break it. And, not that I was somebody who broke cars. And it was light, it was fuel efficient, it did everything it was supposed to do, and it just never stopped working. It's even today I tell people, if they tell me, because I work on cars, they say, "Hey, Art, I'm having a problem with my Honda." And I'm like, it takes a special talent to break a Honda, and it does. So people had become accustomed to driving these cars. And getting back to my father, I recommended to my father, who was in the market for a new car, I said, "You should get a Honda." And he scoffed at me, right? My father scoffed at me. And he says, "A Jap car? Me driving a Jap car?" Right now, of course, Jap today is a derogatory term, but to my father, it was just normal. It was just normal conversation. And he says, "I was trading bullets with those little bastards back on Luzon," which of course is part of the Philippine Islands. And I think the part about him actually trading bullets with them might have been an embellishment, but sorry, Dad. You know, but you see the sentiment. The sentiment was that the United States was the primary builder of these things, and we had the best automobile companies, and nothing's ever going to replace General Motors and Chrysler Motors and Ford for our preeminence in all of these things. But the truth was that by the 1990s, from suffering from quality control issues and overconfidence and poor management, that Japanese car companies, primarily Toyota and certainly Honda, had a permanent foothold in the American market. And Honda had put out the Honda Accord, which was seen as like the most popular car you could possibly have, in addition to Toyota's two cars, the Corolla and the Camry. And there was a tremendous market for them. There was a waiting list to get these cars for the reasons I mentioned about the Honda that I had, because they were just excellent cars. They did everything they were supposed to do. They were highly efficient. And we entered a new era where you had, the typical American car. Even back in those days, if you reached 50,000 miles, you needed suspension parts, you needed an exhaust system, you needed new belts, you needed to change this, you were on your second or third tune-up, and all the rest of these things. And they were rusting out. The Japanese cars typically today, and then you could drive them with proper maintenance. You could drive them to 200,000 miles without a hiccup. And and what happened was the American automobile manufacturers lost their lead. And this was a big thing. It was a big thing technologically and socially in our country. It also had to do with different generations. People of my father's age, right? The Great Depression, World War II, Korean War era. And now you have younger people who might just generally be open to more modern things or newer things, that sort of thing. And then, of course, in the 1990s, those three companies, which were now Nissan, which used to be Datsun, Nissan launched Infiniti, which was a premier brand. Honda was the first to launch a premier brand, which was the Acura. And then, of course, Toyota had Lexus. And now you've got Japanese cars rivaling BMWs and Mercedes Benzes, right? So for those who still have the prejudice about Japan being this defeated thing from days gone by, it was a real change. And by the 1990s, also, Japan was a real powerhouse. In the 1980s, Japan was really like the country that had replaced the United States on the world stage as far as technology and marketing and the building of machines and all the rest of this. And for those who remember, who were old enough, like people like my father is probably a good example, that was a little hard to take because they were more comfortable thinking of Asian countries, particularly, to be inferior. And something that was made from Japan was it was going to work, and then it was going to break after the second time you tried it. You see. And now that had completely flipped, and it was a shock to the psyche of many people. But that's where it was. So in the 1990s, we have the beginning of I remember just recently or semi-recently as called the Me Too movement. Remember the Me Too movement, right? And it was, we're not going to, sexual harassment against women can't be stand for. And if this happened to you, don't be afraid to stand up and say, yeah, me too. I was in Harvey Weinstein's office and, he said I could have the part if I had if I did a little audition on the couch over here. So that sort of a thing. I was surprised to hear the other day that Harvey Weinstein's case is literally going to be overturned from technicalities. Um, Maybe you were too, I don't know. But anyway, Anita Hill, right? That was another thing I remember watching on television. Right? Anita Hill, and of course that was against Clarence Thomas. And basically she was a hero. And I'm not certainly not saying she isn't. Um, but it was something that was here's a strong woman speaking, as we would say, the term would be speaking truth to power, saying, here's why this guy, in this particular case, shouldn't be nominated as a Supreme Court justice because, he's a misogynistic, he was accused of being practically like how we remember Bill Cosby, right? Except without the drugs, that sort of a thing. And so that was like another part of the legacy of the sexual revolution and the empowerment of women movement. And finally to come into the point where it's like, yeah, these maybe things were different than 20 years ago in the 1970s, but it doesn't make the difference. It was wrong then. And I'm going to talk about it now and say, here's what happened, right? Because this is what and we us women were forced into thinking that we had to accept, men smacking us on the backsides as we walk through the office. And I have a certain amount of sympathy for all of that, And so the Anita Hill hearings were something that occurred during the 1990s, of course, if you remember that and whatever that might mean to you. Um, but the big one, and this was brought into our memories just in the past couple of weeks, all right, certainly was with me, was the O.J. Simpson trial, right? And, so we had a whole revision of that upon the death of O.J. Simpson. What was it, a couple of weeks ago, I guess. And but I remember that like it was yesterday. And it was like reality TV, watching this televised trial, when he had the dream team, Johnny Cochran, and all the rest of that, right? If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And it had these racial overtones to it too, right? That it's like, even though OJ was found not guilty, you know, I hear various things about this. And I'm trying to remember what I remember in real time about it, but it was, Black people were happy that he didn't get, he wasn't found guilty, right? Because essentially the entire system is unjust against Black people. So there you go. Finally, Black people wins against the systemic injustice of the justice system. Although I don't know, it kind of seemed to the casual observer like myself, I was like, I think this guy did this. And but there was all of these other racial overtones to it. And I'll let you to remember that as you found it. So it was the double murder of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. And all of this, like I said, was revisited to us a couple of weeks ago. Now, of course, O.J. Simpson was brought in on civil charges after that, and then did some really stupid things. So O.J. Simpson's another person is kind of like without any other knowledge. He had he not just been involved in any of these things, he would have gone down as this hero. Yes, Heisman Trophy winner, and the guy is running around doing Hertz commercials, and he's popular. He's got a nice smile. Everybody loves him. He's got good kids and all the rest of that stuff. He's got a beautiful wife, you know, and but all of this just turned, what was a hero at one point into this sad, tragic, despicable figure, and how many of you were watching that white Bronco on TV? Right? And these endless news commentators that's like, yes, and he's in a white Bronco and he's got a gun and the police are afraid to rush the vehicle and they're just going to let him go to where he's going. I mean, it was a real mm, our kind of world kind of works on this sort of sensationalism now. I'm not saying it's OJ's fault, but things, the more sensational things are, the more salacious things are, right? The more juicy they are, the more that people are falling off a pinnacle and crashing to the ground. I mean, we seem to have an appetite for it, just to make kind of like a casual observation. I think I'm old enough to be able to do that. It's really tragic. Another thing that was tragic, also in the 1990s, if you remember this one, I'm sure you do, was Princess Diana, the Princess of Wales. And I had to write this down because I can never remember this guy's name. Her fiance, Dodi Al Fayed, if I'm pronouncing that right. Excuse me if I'm not. And of course, they left some place and they were being chased by the paparazzi. And they were in what was it, a black Mercedes in Paris, wasn't it? And I don't know, I guess the driver of the Mercedes was just trying to avoid I think they were motorcycles chasing them. I don't remember some of the details. And they wound up having this horrendous crash, which killed them, right? And I thought that was played very well, not directly, but indirectly in the movie with Helen Mirren called The Queen. And if you've ever seen it, I recommend it if you haven't. And it really talks about the Queen and the royal family's reaction to the death of Diana, right? Because it was such an awkward thing that had happened is between Charles and Diana, and the Queen had not recognized the degree that Britons loved Diana and really resented what had happened to her because it seemed like she was kind of chewed up, abused, and spit out by the royal family, and that the King of England and the Queen of England weren't even going to half-staff the flag or anything else like that because it was like, all right, she's just an ex-wife now, and it doesn't matter. And that movie does a great job of going through all of this. I recommend it. And I mean that brings us right up to the present day. I mean, forgive me as a counselor or therapist. I mean, it's like I can't help but think that some of the stuff that's going on in the royal family today, vis-a-vis Harry, isn't a direct legacy to how those two children, Harry and William, perceive the world in regards to not only what happened to their parents' marriage, but also the kind of spectacle of public attention about it as well. See, um, remember John F. Kennedy Jr., right? The handsome dude, right? JFK and Jackie's son, right? And I don't know what they were going to some party on Martha's Vineyard, I guess, right? And any of you know anything about airplanes or fly, when I was a kid, like 14, 15 years old, my brother was a pilot and he had, I don't know, he was 5 years older than me. So he had money like at a very young age. Um, and he flew around a lot, in these airplanes, Cessnas, Pipers, etc. And I used to go with him and I learned how to fly an airplane too. So I learned because I was watching him learn to fly, and I knew the difference between visual flight rules and instrument flight rules. And I knew more about it early on than, most people my age, I suppose, because I vicariously learned it from him. And JFK was not IFR certified, which means instrument flight rules. What that means is that if it's inclement weather, if you can't, visual flight rules means that you got to be able to see what's happening here, you see? And if you can't see, that means you have to rely on your instruments, right? Only. It's like painting the windows white, and you can only rely on your instruments, you see, and radio communications and all the rest of that. So he takes off in what turns out to be inclement weather, which I'm hard pressed to think how that's not his fault. And he winds up in the soup, so to speak. And I assume he becomes disoriented and the airplane crashes, right? It's easy to become disoriented, by the way. I don't know if you've ever been in an airplane when the windows where you're literally in a cloud and you can't see anything. I don't know, it freaked me out, right? So he goes down, he gets killed, kills his wife, Carolyn Bissett, and his sister-in-law, Lauren Bissett, right? So this once again adds to this long list of tragedies that befall the Kennedys, right? The Kennedy curse, you see. And it seems like yesterday. It was a long time ago at this point. And they had to fish, they had to go down and get the airplane and the bodies off the bottom of I don't know, what is that over there? Rhode Island Sound or something? I forget. Here's something that I have written down here. It reminds me of when I was at the Intrepid. And it goes to that cultural thing I was telling you about when I first started off about my memories in graduate school, about like the anti-Americanism, right? Or the anti-traditional Americanism, the melting pot, right? And this was all the rage. And I was pretty much in the center of Manhattan. I was certainly, for where I was, the epicenter of it. I assume there were other epicenters of it, but I'm sticking with, where I was and how I experienced it. In 1992, I worked heavily on an exhibit that we had um, that involved these three, what were they? It was Spanish reproductions of something called the three caravels, right? In other words, replicas of Columbus's ships, right? And they had sailed to New York Harbor, and we were putting together a large exhibition to commemorate the 500th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America, right? Discovery, obviously, in air quotes, right? But so if you want to look at it from a traditional, unrevised history point, Columbus was, kind of a hero. He was when I was a kid. I'm not saying he is. I'm just saying that's the way he was depicted. Certainly in the last 15, 20 years, every single statue of Columbus, except for the one on Columbus Circle in New York City, has been eradicated like it was never there. And Columbus Day has been replaced with Indigenous Peoples Day and all the rest of that sort of things in many places. And so this was I never saw anything like this. This is my, speaking of demonstrations, right? And um, I did a lot of work for these three ships, right, that were going to be there. We had to add extra docking systems. We had to add extra barges. We had to add, all of these paths for millions of people to come and see the three caravels, replicas of Columbus's three ships, right? And I loved it because I always wanted to work in an environment like this on ships. And, it didn't really occur to me too much about Columbus one way or the other. And I was just happy to be working on ships and welding things together and using the skills that I had, my carpentry skills, my welding skills, my administration skills, because I already had people working with me. And I really didn't care. But I was very, very surprised to see what happened once the exhibit opened up. It was highly publicized. We had banners. You could see the three caravels that were right close to 12th Avenue there. And we started experiencing these demonstrations, right? We had people picketing and we had people buying tickets to come into the museum that were, just, hey, I just want to get a ticket to come and see the three caravels. And then they would do things like lay prone in front of the ships, you see. And it was, I got to see this a lot of times, not just for the three caravels, for other things on the Intrepid, because people saw us as kind of like these quasi warmongers for glorifying warfare, right? And so it turns out that Christopher Columbus, instead of being I don't know, a heroic person who opened up the West to I don't know, Western European civilization with the better things that had to offer, was really, in fact, only responsible for European colonialism, slavery, genocide, and essentially cultural destruction. So now I have people spitting on me because I am the embodiment of those negative things, right? And I'm just as bad as Christopher Columbus because not only did the event happen by this genocidal maniac, but now people like me are trying to glorify it by having this exhibit of the three caravels and making it seem like there was anything plausible that Columbus could have possibly done that was beneficial to history, you see. So that was really my first taste for something like that. Um, and it was a big deal. We had to deal with protesters on a regular basis, and I've been spat upon then and in other events commemorating American military history having nothing to do with Columbus. And like I said to you, it was bad enough that the United States was an imperialist force abroad, right? Even during times of like World War II, et cetera. But here I am glorifying it, and I'm more dangerous than the actual people who did what they claim was bad to have been done, because I am inspiring young people who might want to join the military, you see, because they find this to be a noble thing. And that's what makes me so dangerous, me personally. So it was a fascinating exercise in sociology for me and activism. Here's another one from the 1990s. Probably not the most important thing on our list, but interesting nonetheless. Do you remember Lorena Bobbitt? Yeah, you remember Lorena Bobbitt. You want to stay away from Lorena Bobbitt. You know why? She was charged with malicious wounding, which I have to admit is a charge I've never heard of before, right? And don't want to hear about it ever again. Um, because she severed her husband, John Bobbitt's penis with, I don't know, assume a knife or something. Gosh, I hope it was sharp for his sake. And it turns out that both parties were, and he has supposedly been sexually abusive to her. I think he tried to force sex on her or something like that. Obviously, a reprehensible thing. And she got her revenge. And the two of them were exonerated, she of her assault on him and he of her assaults on her, right? They were both acquitted of their crimes, but what a salacious, what a story. I think that somebody found his penis like laying there somewhere and they put it in like a Ziploc. And miraculously, they were able to actually reattach the thing, you know, with microsurgery. Now, if you're not impressed by that, I can't help you, you know? Oh, here was a good one. Nancy Kerrigan. Remember this? Nancy Kerrigan. I picked these things because somehow in my mind, I'm like, yeah, that was a good one. I watched that on TV. And I watched a television movie about what's her name, Tanya Harding afterwards. What a fruitcake, you know, that sort of a thing. And yeah, Nancy Kerrigan, right? So she got it. Remember, she got kneecapped by some thug that was hired by Jeff Galooly, who was the ex-husband, former husband of skater Tanya Harding, right? I remember watching this on TV. I remember like Tanya Harding, you know, when she was skating and she's crying and she puts her skate up on the desk of where the judges were. It's like, I don't know, it's not laced right. You know, I remember that whole thing. And I don't even like figure skating, but no, I had to watch this, right? And right, that was before the 1994 Winter Olympics, and like Tanya Harding was like this, I don't know, white trash kind of person, you know, out of the trailer park. And there's Nancy Kerrigan, you know, who's done everything right in her life. And she's really a nice girl and she's pretty and she's talented and it just can't be tolerated. You know, it was just, it's like a great Lifetime movie. My wife watches Lifetime all the time, you know. I go out there sometimes to say, well, I see what she's watching. And I hate to admit it, but I sit there and like next thing you know, I'm into it. And then I'm like ashamed that I'm into it. I'm getting off the subject, aren't I? Um, Now speaking of riots, here's another one. LA riots, 1992. Remember this one? Remember Rodney King? Right? So there were 53 deaths as a result of this, 5,500 property fires after a Los Angeles jury acquitted 3 white cops and 1 Hispanic cop. And it was an all-white jury, right? And that was another problem, I guess. It was a police brutality case involving a motorist named Rodney King. And that the LA riots were in response to this perceived injustice that these cops were let off by an obviously racist white jury, right? Because the white people are going to, of course, let off white people, including the Hispanic person, of any kind of crime involving a black, you see? So this was retribution for the injustice of the system, right? 53 deaths, 5,500 property fires. As it turns out, that a federal civil rights lawsuit was brought against these police officers, and they were all found guilty. And that was a civil rights case. Right? You know, after the fall of the Soviet Union, going back to the earlier part of the decade, there was this another thing that I remember, you know, if you're interested in Israeli politics, where you had all of these Russian Jews, which for the first time were able to and were welcomed to emigrate to Israel, right? Does anybody remember that? I mean, if you're interested in this sort of thing, it was a bit of a phenomenon. We didn't realize how many people were locked up in Russia and couldn't leave. And there was this tremendous immigration of all of these Russian Jews. And the idea was that if you were a Jew anywhere in the world, you were welcome in Israel. That here, and for the first time, you can live as a Jew without being persecuted, right? I find over the last, I don't know, couple of weeks, I guess, that the kind of history that people know as young people, right? Now, I'm apologize for painting with too broad a paintbrush. I realize that that's wrong, but it doesn't seem like people know much about history, in certain regards, and I'm sympathetic to the plight of the Jews having a homeland. I mean, I probably know more about Nazi Germany than I know about not anything else. And the rise of hate, the rise of anti-Semitism, the abuses of social Darwinism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's frankly quite depressing to me to think that the world has got to keep making the same mistakes over and over again. I don't know if that depresses you, but I find it troubling. Okay. And troubling is a euphemism. Um, and yeah, talked about that. Talked about the Gulf War. The only thing I've got here that I didn't mention was another thing. We had, a lot of stuff going on in the 1990s. If you remember Slobodan Milosevic and all kinds of other things, and Clinton was actually trying to do something about it. But it was an inconvenience in this new time of our peace dividend, right? You had a lot of ethnic cleansing and things going on. I'll only mention one of them, the Rwandan genocide of 1994. Hundreds of thousands of Rwanda's Tutsis and Hulu moderates were killed by the Hulu-dominated government under the Hulu power ideology, right? This would require a presentation on itself, right? In 100 days, up to 1 million people were killed, right? The United Nations, once again, who was supposed to help prevent things like this, came under criticism for literally not doing anything. So, as much as things change, nothing changes. So there's our program. In the time that I have, we're already at 3:31 according to my little clock over here. I had to pick things to put in here. I realized that I left out some things that others might think that I should have put in, but I hope you enjoyed my interpretation of events and some of the recollections. I'm sure it must have knocked loose some memories for you. As always, I want to thank you for the privilege of having you be in my audience for this hour and a half during this series. God bless you all.
Thank you, Art, for your time. We do appreciate it, and we do love having you here doing your lectures and whatnot. And like you said, it is very hard to do a decade in an hour and a half, but you do a phenomenal job. For anyone who missed any of the previous sessions, they will be available on our YouTube page. Please keep an eye out for more library lecture programs in the near future. We hope to have Art come back real soon. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and we hope to see you all very soon. Bye-bye for now.